Did Auguste Comte believe in altruism?
Yes. In fact, Comte coined the word altruism, meaning an obligation to help and serve others, even at cost or harm to one's own self-interests.
Did Hume believe in miracles?
Probably not, although he did not explicitly deny them. Hume's arguments were directed toward assessing the truth of reports of miracles. Such assessment would address the credibility of witnesses and the remoteness in time and distance of their accounts. Hume thought that if someone reported a miracle, we should ask this question: which is more likely? Based on everything we know about the world, that the miracle happened, or that it did not.
What was Bertrand Russell's theory of definite descriptions?
Russell gave an account of how it is possible to talk meaningfully about things that do not exist. According to his theory of definite descriptions, what a proposition of the form X is Q means is: there is exactly one thing that is X and that one thing is Q. Or, at least one thing is X and no more than one thing is X and whatever is X is Q. Russell's theory makes it possible to distinguish between the contradiction of X is Q and X is not Q. To use Russell's example, A, the King of France is bald has as its contradictory, A, there is no King of France, or there is more than one King of France, or there is one King of France who is not bald. But, B, the King of France is not bald means, according to Russell's theory, B, there is one King of France, no more and no less, and he is not bald. And, A and B do not have the same meaning.
How did Anaximander seek to revise Thales' philosophy?
Anaximander, c. 610 to 545 BCE, was interested in the idea of what was hot and dry. This was supposed by him to be opposed to Thales' idea of water, which was cold and wet. He reasoned that water could not be the primary substance out of which everything else was made, because the primary substance must be the cause of all the others. Since water is wet and often cold, it cannot be the source of anything that is hot and dry. Therefore, Anaximander reasoned, the primary substance must be something different from both water and things that are hot and dry. Anaximander called his primary substance, which cannot be perceived only things that are cold and wet or hot and dry can be perceived, a pyrrhon, or that which is eternal and causes other things to change, but does not change itself. A pyrrhon, in other words, is that thing which can't be perceived itself but which is the origin of all things hot and cold, wet and dry. And for how these things change it is responsible for everything in the world as we can and do perceive it. According to Anaximander, we see the sun, moon, and stars through holes in a cold, wet vapor that encloses earth. On earth, wet and dry have formed land and sea. And living things are the result of the sun's effect on moisture. All life started in the sea, according to Anaximander. A theory that actually anticipates the theory of evolution.
What is the story of Descartes' life?
René Descartes, 1596–1650, father was a member of the minor nobility. His mother died when he was 13 months old. And after his father remarried, he was raised by his maternal grandmother. At 10 he was sent to the new Jesuit college of La Flèche in Anjou, France. And there studied the classics, history, rhetoric, and Aristotelian natural philosophy. Although he considered La Flèche an excellent school, he thought that the natural philosophy he learned there was doubtful, mainly because it was based on scholastic abstractions that had been outdated by more recent discoveries and thought. Descartes then took a law degree at Poitiers and set off to complete his education by travel in Europe. He wrote that he had resolved to seek no knowledge other than that which could be found either in myself or the great book of the world. He served briefly in the army and then became friends with Isaac Beeckman. 1588–1637, a Dutch philosopher and scientist who inspired him to study mathematics. Descartes' first book, Compendium Musicae, applied mathematics to harmony and dissonance. Descartes also began work on his discovery of analytic geometry that was published in 1637.
Was Jonathan Edwards merciful toward sinners?
Not in the least. Jonathan Edwards thought that many humans were depraved and that a real hell awaited them. There is a tone of delight in these facts in his 1741 sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Edwards not only believed that sinners would be punished, but that God himself had no pity for their agony. He wrote, "If you cry to God to pity you, he will be so far from pitying you in your doleful case, or showing you the least regard or favor, that instead of that, he will only tread you underfoot. And though he will know that you cannot bear the weight of omnipotence treading upon you, yet he will not regard that, but he will crush you under his feet without mercy, he will crush out your blood, and make it fly, and it shall be sprinkled on his garments, so as to stain all his raiment. He will not only hate you, but he will have you in the utmost contempt. No place shall be thought fit for you, but under his feet to be trodden down as the mire of the streets." And, in so far as the virtuous strive to emulate God, Edwards felt it is fitting that they enjoy the suffering of such sinners in hell. In 1758, in his Why Saints in Glory Will Rejoice to See the Torments of the Damned, Edwards wrote, "When they shall see how miserable others of their fellow creatures are, who were naturally in the same circumstances with themselves. When they shall see the smoke of their torment, and the raging of the flames of their burning, and hear their dolorous shrieks and cries. And consider that they in the meantime are in the most blissful state, and shall surely be in it to all eternity, how will they rejoice?"
How did Prodicus make his living?
Prodicus, b. 460 b.c.e, a sophist, was an ambassador for his home city of Ceos. He traveled widely and became rich from his exhibitions. One of his specialties was distinguishing between synonyms. And Socrates claimed in Plato's Protagoras and Meno to have been his student. Prodicus had two versions of his talks, the 1 drachma lecture and the 50 drachma lecture. Socrates joked that he would have been more learned about words if he'd been able to afford the 50 drachma lecture. The 1 drachma lecture had much larger audiences, but, according to Aristotle, Prodicus sometimes gave the larger audiences a bargain by slipping in the 50 drachma lecture for them. If Aristotle's story is true, scholarly commentators have overlooked the possibility that the sophists invented modern sales techniques.
What was Hobbes' theory of government in Leviathan?
Hobbes advocated a strong form of monarchy as a way of redescribing the role of the individual in his own politically volatile society. He began with the idea of a state of nature, which was a condition of life without government. Hobbes' method was to determine the uses and justification for government. From that original condition, together with an understanding of human nature. According to Hobbes, human beings in their natural condition are each roughly equal in physical strength. Because the weakest has the ability to kill the strongest. They are not sociable by nature, but rather exist in a prolonged condition in which each individual is against everyone else, a condition of war. In fact, humans only seek one another out for their own glory, greed, or to gang up and conspire against third parties. Without government and the stable organizations and institutions created and supported by government, life in a state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Men do have right reason in nature, the first principle of which is to preserve themselves. They are also aware of the laws of nature, the first of which is to do whatever is possible to keep the peace. But to keep the peace, there needs to be an enforceable contract between parties. And after one side has performed, there is no guarantee that the other will do his or her part. Hobbes wrote that covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all.
What was the reaction to the meditations?
Catholic theologians found René Descartes' doubt in the existence of God too convincing to be resolved by his ontological argument. Others were left with a division of the world into two radically different substances of mind and matter. A dualism very difficult to resolve. Mind could be directly introspected, but it eluded science. Matter, by which Descartes meant insensible particles that had only size, shape, quantity, and mass, primary qualities, was the ultimate subject of science. Descartes believed that we know less about matter than mind. The question was, how are mind and matter connected? Descartes' ideas of substance, his dualism, and the mind-body problem preoccupied his contemporaries and successors. Benedict de Spinoza, 1632–1677, reacted with a dual aspect theory of God and nature. Nicolas Malebranche, 1638–1715, tried to answer the question of how mind and matter were connected with his theory of occasionalism. Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, also had a version of occasionalism in his theory of pre-established harmony. On the empiricist side, Thomas Hobbes, 1588–1679, insisted on the non-existence of anything non-material, and John Locke, 1632–1704, directly attacked Descartes' idea of substance. Descartes thought that substance was what held matter together and what held mind together. Even though substance could not be experienced directly. According to Descartes, all physical things were material substance and all mental things immaterial substance.
What is moral conventionalism?
Ethical or moral conventionalism is the view that what makes something good or an action right is a general cultural belief. Ethical conventionalism has descriptive and prescriptive forms. Prescriptive conventionalism says that we ought to follow conventions. Descriptive conventionalism says that we do follow conventions.
What is Native American philosophy?
Native American tribes and nations have held well-developed worldviews, religions, epistemologies, metaphysics, and social and political views long before Europeans invaded and appropriated their lands. Much of this knowledge was transmitted orally and subject to loss and fragmentation. Following what many indigenous people call the Native American Holocaust, the development of Native American philosophy as a subfield in academic philosophy requires not just reconstruction of past knowledge but some acceptance of the methods of Western philosophy. The problem is that these methods are highly problematic for most indigenous thinkers. Furthermore, after centuries of distorted descriptions of their cultures by anthropologists and government officials, Most Native American philosophers have a strong preference for speaking in their own voices, rather than agreeing to let others present their perspectives. There are not very many Native Americans in U.S. university philosophy departments at this time, perhaps fewer than 50. Nevertheless, since the 1980s a canon of Native American philosophy has developed, which includes the following sources: The Sacred Hoop by Paula Gunn Allen, 1986, How It Is, The Native American Philosophy of V. F. Cordova by Linda Hogan, by Kathleen Dean Moore, Kurt Peters, and Ted Jojoba, 2007, Cultural Sites of Critical Insight, Philosophy, Aesthetics, and African American and Native American Women's Writings, by Angela L. Cotton and Krista Davis, 2007, American Indian Thought, Philosophical Essays, by N. Waters, 2003. And Defending Mother Earth, Native American Perspectives on Environmental Justice, by Jace Weaver, 1996.
What were the general ideas about women that were held by people in the 17th century?
The old Aristotelian idea that females were imperfect males was still assumed to be true in 17th century Europe. The modern science of biology, which established two distinct sexes, was still in the future. Although 18th and 19th century sexual distinctions based on biology supported the idea that the capabilities of women were inherently limited and inferior to those of men, they at least focused on the distinctness of male and female identities. The Aristotelian view has been called the one-sex theory. Many serious and well-regarded theorists of the human body solemnly insisted that the female reproductive system was no more than an inverted form of the male one. Like Aristotle, they believed that women were naturally colder and damper than men, besides being in every respect weaker. Moreover, women were considered to be the sex-desiring, aggressive gender, whereas men were often viewed as helpless and vulnerable in sexual matters. Medical opinion concurred that blood, semen, and spinal fluid were all the same basic vital substance or fluid, albeit in different forms. Sexual intercourse was not only often viewed as a weakening form of physical dissipation, but male ejaculation was believed to draw brain tissue down the spine and out the penis, a very strong reason for a male philosopher to remain celibate. Moreover, women were viewed as the source of venereal disease, unwanted children, and burdensome financial obligations. So great was their negative sexual power held to be that they were at the same time also presumed responsible for male impotence.
What did Søren Kierkegaard deem his main vocation in life?
Kierkegaard felt his main vocation was to reintroduce Christianity into Christendom. For him, Christianity was a way of existing. He thought that only humans existed, because they have internal reality. In contrast to God, who has external reality. Faith for him was an inward leap in answer to one burning question about God.
Who first came up with the concept of atoms?
Democritus, c. 460 to 371 BCE. A student of Leucippus, Fluid 450 to 420, who opposed Parmenides and Zeno. c. 490 c. 430 BCE, by saying that empty space is real, said that existence is made up of a very large number of things that cannot be cut apart. He called these things atomos or atoms. Atoms are in motion within infinite space. They collide, and their movement creates a vortex. Out of that, different kinds of things result. The only real qualities that we can perceive are size and shape. Because the atoms have that, but everything else available to the senses is an illusion. Democritus was the originator of what became the modern theory of atoms.
What was meant by reason during the Enlightenment?
Reason was considered a universal capacity of all people that was brought to fruition by logic and the knowledge of science. It required people to abandon superstition and oppressive institutions, such as absolute monarchy and doctrinaire religion.
Who was Alan Matheson Turing?
Alan Matheson Turing, 1912 to 1954. Was a British cryptologist and mathematician who is credited with founding modern computer science. His Turing machine, which was an extensive thought experiment, formalized the concepts of algorithms and computation. The Turing machine consists of a possibly infinite paper tape with a stream of binary symbols that is continually scanned by a read-write device moving left or right and erasing or writing symbols on the tape, according to a program. Turing showed that any such machine could be programmed to simulate any other one, meaning that it was a universal machine. This universal machine could implement every known mathematical method. He extended this model to machines that cannot be simulated by a universal Turing machine, called oracle machines. Turing proposed that intellectual activity can be understood as networks of universal and non-universal machines that can learn, through training, to become something like universal machines. After the invention of actual electronic computers, Turing suggested that theories of artificial intelligence could be tested. If there were a computer that could perform the same calculations as a human being to the point where a human being could not tell whether the results were produced by the computer or by another human being, then there could theoretically exist artificial intelligence. Turing's 1950 article in Mind, Can Machines Think? Continues to be highly influential in philosophy of mind discussions. In part as a result of John Searle's, 1932, treatment of it.
Does philosophy have anything to do with ordinary life, today?
Yes. Philosophy has a lot to do with our daily lives. But, depending on the reader's interests, some parts of it will seem more relevant than others. And some parts of philosophy are more abstract than others.
How did Aristotle's main ideas compare to Plato's?
Aristotle rejected Plato's claim that only the forms are real and that there is another world of forms outside of the world that we perceive in ordinary life. But he agreed with Plato that knowledge must have certainty. Therefore, his main philosophical task was to describe what made objects real in this world and explain how we can have certain knowledge about them. He also developed a system of logic, or rules of thought, that would guarantee certainty if one began with premises that were certain.
Who is Julia Kristeva?
Since arriving in France in 1966 from Bulgaria, Julia Kristeva, 1941, has achieved international recognition for her writings about women in the psychoanalytic tradition. Her work is considered multidisciplinary, encompassing art criticism, philosophy, and cultural critique. Kristeva's primary theoretical contribution has been a distinction between the symbolic aspects of language and what she calls the semiotic, a psychic level of meaning based on a child's relationship to its mother. Primary human desires are attached to the semiotic, which is based on the biological rhythms of the maternal body. Although the semiotic eludes symbolic translation,
Was there other philosophical activity in St. Louis besides the St. Louis Hegelians?
contemporary with the St. Louis Philosophical Society, and also located in St. Louis, were a Kant Club, an Aristotle Club, and a Plato Club that later became known as Academe.
Who was John Rawls?
John Rawls, 1921 to 2002, was educated at Princeton University and taught at Princeton. the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cornell University, and Harvard University. He is credited with almost single-handedly reviving Anglo-American political philosophy in his A Theory of Justice, 1971. Relying on both Kantian morality and the basic principles of consent by those governed from social contract theory, Rawls outlined a model for a just society. His additional publications include Political Liberalism, 1993, The Law of Peoples, 1999, Collected Papers, 2000, and Essays in the History of Philosophy, 2001.
What was Hilary Putnam's neo-pragmatism?
In the 1970s he began to regret the lack of historical knowledge in analytic philosophy. He applied Ludwig Wittgenstein's, 1889–1951, notion of ordinary language to advocate for pluralism within philosophy. He lost confidence in the ability of philosophers to describe the world better than ordinary language users. Given his increased interest in the social sciences, particularly economics, he rejected the fact/value dichotomy. Putnam argued that scientists were not as objective or free of value concerns as they presented themselves to be, and that value judgments can be objective.
What is moral theory?
Moral theory is the intellectual assessment and comparison of different moral or ethical systems. For instance, if we compare consequentialism and deontology, then we are working within moral theory. To some extent, anyone who argues for their own moral system does some amount of moral theory. For example, Jeremy Bentham, 1748–1832, in his dismissal of human rights as nonsense upon stilts, wanted to replace discourse about rights with calculations about pleasure. And Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, in distinguishing between hypothetical and categorical judgments and elevating the latter, were both engaged in moral theory.
What is American philosophy?
The term American philosophy most often refers to the school of pragmatism, which began in the late 19th century. Pragmatism is internationally recognized to be a distinct form of philosophy, not only created by philosophers from the United States, but also reflective of American culture. There were, of course, intellectuals in the United States before the pragmatists, and some of their work was highly original, linked to distinct cultures, 17th, 18th, and 19th century political theorists, abolitionists, suffragists, evolutionists, Native American thinkers, American Hegelians, and New England transcendentalists. Many American philosophers after the pragmatists have worked within analytic, empirical, continental, and postmodern traditions, as well as later forms of pragmatism. American philosophy, broadly understood as an intellectual aspect of culture, would include all of these fields. However, American philosophy, as systematic philosophy, traditionally understood, narrows the subject down.
What was Immanuel Kant's theory of the self?
Kant distinguished between the empirical ego and the transcendental ego. The empirical ego is what we normally think of as the self and are able to experience. The transcendental ego is the necessary origin of those fundamental structures of thought and intuition that are necessary for experience. The transcendental ego is known only as an object of thought, and not as an object of direct experience.
What was unusual about Hume's theory of the emotions?
Although Hume exalted reason over faith when it came to knowledge, when it came to human psychology, he believed that we are primarily motivated by our emotions or passions, and that reason is always in the service of these emotions. That is, unlike Benedict de Spinoza, 1632–1677, he did not have a cognitive theory of the emotions, according to which what we feel is the result of what we believe. Hume wrote, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions."
How are existentialism and phenomenology historically related?
Existentialism and phenomenology both begin with the facts of human reality, from the standpoint of the first person. As distinctive traditions of thought, both have roots in the 19th century. Existentialism going back to Fyodor Dostoevsky, 1821–1881, Søren Kierkegaard, 1813–1855. And Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844–1900, and phenomenology originating with Franz Brentano, 1837–1917. Strictly speaking, existentialism is older than phenomenology. Although some 20th-century existentialists have sought to base their work on that of more contemporary phenomenologists, rather than their 19th-century existentialist predecessors.
What is ethical subjectivism?
Ethical subjectivism is either the same as ethical emotivism, or the view that ethical judgments express our shared emotions, or else it refers to an individual's private moral views as the meaning of morality. So that in principle there could be as many moral systems as there are individuals.
What is a meme?
In The Selfish Gene, 1976, British evolutionary biologist, Professor and author Richard Dawkins coined the term as being on a par with gene. A meme, for instance, a tune, recipe, moral system, or style of dress gets passed on from one generation to the next via cultural interaction. Although memes are not usually held to be physically inherited the way that genes are, social biologists believe them to be subject to natural selection and mutation.
How was Jonathan Swift opposed to Enlightenment values?
Jonathan Swift, 1667 to 1745, is considered to have been at heart a sincere Christian who did not believe in the rationality of human nature, but rather thought that whenever order is established, it then begins to disintegrate. In 1709, in a project for the advancement of reason and the reformation of manners, he implored Queen Anne to begin a moral crusade against contemporary vice. However, the great irony about Swift was that his characteristic path to moral reform was through satire and sarcasm. He sent up the established respectability of his age through forays into fiction, as well as the rhetoric of a pamphleteer. Thus, when it became clear that he would not get support for the plight of the poor in Ireland, he and his friends founded the Scriblouse Club for the sake of engaging in activity against the dunces. Swift is most famous for his 1726 satire, Gulliver's Travels. His 1729 a modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people from being a burthen to their parents or country, and for making them beneficial to the public, was a shocking criticism of the treatment of the Irish poor, in which he suggested that their babies be substituted for the traditional goose that graced the tables of absentee English landlords.
Isn't philosophy just a dry subject?
Not at all. Many philosophers were eccentrics, and the history of philosophy is chock full of bizarre incidents and unusual trivia.
What was Bernard Bosanquet's aesthetic theory?
Bosanquet, in his A History of Aesthetic, 1892, provided an historical development of beauty. In the ancient world, beauty was imitation, whereas in Hegel's objective idealist philosophy, beauty is reality itself. Following Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, he held that we experience objects as beautiful because they present the structures and organizing qualities of reason in perceptible forms.
How are dogs like cynics?
The English word cynic comes from the Greek kin, which means dog. Diogenes of Sinope thought people could learn much from dogs, who were not ashamed of their bodily functions, not picky eaters, and did not care where they slept. Dogs neither worry, nor care about academic philosophy. And they know immediately if someone is a friend or an enemy. What's more, dogs, unlike humans, are honest. Like a dog, Diogenes had no use for family structures, social organizations, politics, private property, or good reputation. He is said to have masturbated in the agora, marketplace, and replied to those who insulted him by urinating on them. He also gestured at others with his middle finger. Plato described him as a Socrates gone mad, because of his contempt for convention and knowledge of philosophy. Many considered Diogenes a man of wisdom. Alexander the Great once sought Diogenes out, when the philosopher was bathing in his wine barrel, which he did often because of a painful skin condition. When Alexander offered to give him anything in the world he wanted, Diogenes replied, "Please get out of my sunlight," or words to that effect.
What were Auguste Comte's sociological ideas?
Comte believed that in all the sciences, there are three historical phases: theological, metaphysical, and scientific or positive. The theological phase contains religious restrictions and belief in the supernatural. The metaphysical phase involves the justification of political rights above authority. In the scientific phase, solutions to social problems can be found. By combining these laws of phases, Comte developed an encyclopedic law, according to which all of the sciences could be ordered into a hierarchy in which sociology was the greatest and included all of the others. Comte wrote, "If it is true that every theory must be based upon observed facts, it is equally true that facts cannot be observed without the guidance of some theories." He thus posited an interconnection between facts and theories, which holds to this day.
What was Alexius Mening's theory of value?
Our emotions and desires have a cognitive ability to discern value. This does not mean that our emotions and desires can think, but that they tell us something about the world, often faster than our minds. Objects, those things intended by us, present themselves with value features. For instance, the smell of the apple directs me to eat it. It has the value of being good to eat. Or a sunset presents itself as beautiful. A property that does not reduce to facts about the refraction of light or the amount of pollution in the air. There are also value universals, such as the good, the beautiful, the agreeable, the desirable, and different kinds of the obligatory, the general category of our duties. Meinung distinguished between dignitatives that are associated with ideas of the good, and desideratives associated with ideas of duty.
What did Maurice Merleau-Ponty mean by a phenomenology of perception?
Merleau-Ponty opposed the abstract natures of both empiricism, which generalized, and idealism, which denied the direct experience and existence of physical reality. He proclaimed that the perceiving mind is an incarnate mind, meaning that it was in the body in the sense of being coincident with the body. Perception is a physical process involving eyes, ears, the nose, the hands, rather than only the mind. His focus was thus on the human body as a perceiving, living part of world. A position theretofore much neglected in philosophical inquiry. According to Merleau-Ponty, perception is neither abstract nor scientific. Rather, all perception is lived, it is the experience of human beings in the world. Consciousness is, to use a later term, embodied and always engaged in perceiving the world. What is phenomenological about human experience is that what is perceived cannot be separated from how it is perceived or from how it is described. In conversation with Ferdinand de Saussure, 1857–1913, Merleau-Ponty composed the prose of the world. 1969, claiming that meaning is not determined by history but by the subject's actual experience in the world. Language is itself continually changing as a result of this experience. In The Visible and the Invisible, Merleau-Ponty had intended to show how communication and thought can go beyond perception, but he died before completing that project.
What are Zeno's paradoxes?
Zeno's paradoxes continue to occupy mathematicians and philosophers today. His paradox of motion applies to any distance. The paradox states that, before you can walk across a room, you have to travel half of the distance, one half, but before that, you must traverse half of that half distance. 1/4, and before that, half of that distance, 1/8, and so on. Because there are an infinite number of divisions of any given distance traveled, it is impossible to go anywhere from anywhere else. Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise applies a slightly different principle to a race. Suppose that Achilles, in a race with a tortoise, gives the tortoise a head start. Before Achilles can pass the tortoise, he must get to the place where the tortoise has been. But because the tortoise will always have moved on from that place, Achilles will never be able to pass the tortoise.
Why was John Locke important?
As a philosopher of knowledge, or epistemologist, John Locke, 1632–1704, sidestepped the metaphysical problems raised by René Descartes, 1596–1650, and offered a theory of the mind and its capabilities that grounded modern ideas of education, psychology, and philosophy of science. Locke's political views about democratic government and individual rights were foundational, not only for the modern British parliamentary system, but also for the basic principles of the U.S. Constitution. His idea of natural law persists in practical political theories to this day.
What were Edmund Burke's political background and beliefs?
Edmund Burke, 1729–1797, was a member of the British House of Commons from 1765 to 1794. In his early career, which was more literary than philosophical, he propounded a romantic view of art. As a statesman, he resisted political and social change based on ideals and abstract ideas. Although he supported political change that would re-establish proven rights or customs. For example, while he was opposed to the French Revolution for its ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, he was in favor of the Irish movement for independence and the American Revolution.
What is Pierre-Simon Laplace's theory of probability?
The fact that we do not know certain things gives rise to the idea of probabilities. Because we view the world as determined in assuming that every event has a cause. The probability of an event depends on a combination of what we do know and what we do not know. Laplace's theory of probability was that if there is no reason to believe that one of a number of events n will occur, then the probability of each happening is 1/n. For example, the probability that any day of the week chosen at random will be either a Tuesday or a Thursday is 2/7.
What was G. E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy?
Moore, 1873–1958, contended that goodness cannot be analyzed in terms of any other property. In his Principia Ethica, 1903, he wrote, "It may be true that all things which are good are also something else. Just as it is true that all things which are yellow produce a certain kind of vibration in the light. And it is a fact, that ethics aims at discovering what are those other properties belonging to all things which are good." But far too many philosophers have thought that when they named those other properties they were actually defining good. Moore thought that we know what is good directly, just as we know the color yellow when we see it. Thus, we can only point to an action or a thing and say that is good. We cannot describe to a blind man exactly what yellow is. We can only show a sighted man a piece of yellow paper or a yellow scrap of cloth and say that is yellow. The same is true of what is good.
What was the goal of the encyclopedists?
The goal of the encyclopedists was to gather together, in a collection of contemporary volumes, everything known at the time in all fields. Their main contributors were Denis Diderot, 1713–1784, Jean-Léon d'Alembert, 1717–1783. Baron Paul Henri Dietrich de Holbach, 1723–1789, and Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu. 1689–1755, as well as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–1778, and Voltaire, 1694–1778. Their work was humanistic and scientifically inclined. However, its anti-clerical themes resulted in royal censorship in 1750. Although the project endured until 1777, there were 140 contributors and almost 150 additional writers and engravers to the project. The 32 volumes produced had more than 70,000 entries, with 11 volumes of plates and 21 of printed text.
How did Locke use natural law to construct a theory of government?
In the first treatise on government, 1689, Locke argued against English political theorist Robert Filmer, who claimed that kings, in a direct descent from Adam, had divine rights. Locke pointed out that it was impossible to trace such a direct descent with any accuracy. That human beings had female as well as male parents, and that political power was fundamentally different from patriarchal power. In the second treatise on government, 1689, he identified natural law as God's laws for man, which included the command that man labor for his living. God had given the earth and everything on it to all mankind. Locke therefore asked how it came to be that there was private property, which was necessary to make use of the fruits of the earth. His answer was that whatever an individual mixes his labor with he comes to own. Locke used the term mixes labor with for labor, in cases where we today would say works on. Locke went on to claim that, in the state of nature, there were two provisos against accumulation through labor: that there be as much and as good left over, and that there be no waste. The first proviso assumed that natural resources would never run out. The second allowed for the store of unused items in precious objects that could be used as money, thereby allowing surplus production to be stored as wealth without the original producer being wasteful. In Locke's state of nature there was industry, cooperation, and trade. Human beings were basically peaceful, except for a few criminals. To assure justice in punishment, government was necessary. But it was merely a convenience added to a generally functional and satisfying situation.
What were the main themes and claims in classic African American literature?
Until the Emancipation Proclamation, 1862, the main issue was the abolition of black slavery. From the end of the Civil War until the Civil Rights Movement of the late 1950s that resulted in legislation against discrimination in 1964, the issue was discrimination against blacks and their social and legal exclusion from opportunities in employment, education on all levels, housing, adequate medical care, and fairness in the criminal justice system. At the same time, support for and construction of positive identities for African Americans was a central concern.
Who were the Stoics and what did they believe?
Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium, 334–262 B. CE, whose work was carried on by Cleanthes, 331–322 BCE. Who was then succeeded by Chrysippus, c. 280–206 BCE. The name Stoic came from the stoapoikil, or painted colonnade, where Stoics first gathered in Athens. According to these early Stoics, the entire world is a morally good organism, with different phases in which events operate according to divine reason, or logos. The sequence of events is predetermined by fate. Each world phase ends in a big fire and is then repeated in a continuous, never-ending cycle. Early Stoic ethics held that only virtue is good, and only vice is bad. Other things, such as health or wealth, may be preferred, but they are morally indifferent. We each have a unique role in the world plan and our job is to learn what it is. Such learning creates concern for the self, which can and should be extended to close relatives and friends and, after them, all humanity. The Stoics may have been the first cosmopolitans. Learning is based on assent to impressions. Until all of a person's thoughts become related and unassailable by reason. By counseling that we assent to impressions, the Stoics meant that we should not deny anything that is presented to us as either a fact or an opinion but simply acknowledge its effect on us. Such Stoic certainty formed the dogmatism opposed by the skeptics.
What is philosophy for children?
Philosophy for children is an attempt both to introduce critical thinking and the subject of philosophy to high school students and to explore and develop natural interest in philosophical questions among younger children. In Europe, high school age students have traditionally had at least some philosophy on their curricula. The question in the United States is not whether teenagers are capable of learning philosophy, but how to introduce it and find teachers qualified to do so, as well as funding. while psychologist Jean Piaget set the paradigm that children are not able to think about thinking or engage in philosophy before about age 12, philosopher Gareth Matthews, 1929, argues in Philosophy and the Young Child, 1980, that there was evidence of philosophical thought and speech in Piaget's own young subjects. Before then, Matthew Lipman, 1922, had introduced philosophy to middle school children in Montclair, New Jersey, with his 96-page philosophical novel for children, Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery, 1974. A philosophical novel for children is a story that raises philosophical issues in language that a child can understand. Both Matthews and Lipman have stressed the active nature of children's philosophical interests. By contrast, Norwegian author Jostein Gaarder's best-selling young adult novel Sophie's World, a novel about the history of philosophy, 1994, leads the reader through a series of studies about philosophy. Thus, philosophy for teenagers may be more didactic than the philosophy already taught to children. Contemporary journals devoted to teaching children philosophy include Analytic Teaching, the Community of Inquiry Journal, Critical and Creative Thinking, the Australasian Journal of Philosophy for Children. Questions, Philosophy for Young People, and Thinking, the Journal of Philosophy for Children.
What was Boyle's method of transdiction?
Boyle, 1627–1691, pointed out that our senses are limited, as shown by findings from telescopes and microscopes. He thought that analogy could be used to extend sense knowledge. Atoms or corpuscles could be understood as analogous to objects we can sense. In this sense, atoms have the same principles of action as objects that can be sensed. Boyle backed up his atomic theory with reports of his own experiments, which, based on the premise that atoms exist, confirmed his predictions about gases, solids, and heat.
Who was Ludwig Wittgenstein?
Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889–1951, had two distinct philosophical periods. First, was his ambitious development of logical atomism that was influenced by his teacher Bertrand Russell. 1872–1970, resulting in his writing Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921. Second was Wittgenstein's original, ordinary language theory of Philisophy. This was an original insight about ordinary language. Wittgenstein was unquestionably a genius.
What were Aquinas' views on science?
As an Aristotelian, Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, believed that every object has its proper place. He also held the Eudoxian astronomical view that Earth was in the center of 49 to 53 concentric spheres. However, he thought that scientific conclusions required judgment and assessment, so that all findings and reports should be considered and compared. He also believed that scientific information could be changed and revised, which is a strong tenet of modern empiricism.
Why was Bernardo Telesio called the first of the moderns by Francis Bacon?
Bernardo Telesio, 1509 to 1588, studied philosophy, physics, and mathematics at the University of Padua. Receiving his doctorate at the age of 26. His subsequent pedagogical activity consisted of conversations with friends under the patronage of the Carafa family in Naples. He was also sought after by Pope Gregory XIII, 1502 to 1585, who invited him to Rome. Telesio's major work was on the nature of things according to their principles. Telesio's innovation was to propose that knowledge of nature be based on sensory information about matter and the forces of heat and cold. Because of this emphasis on sensory information, Telesio is credited with laying the groundwork for more rigorous ideas about scientific investigation, which would soon follow in the work of Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, and Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642. However, Telesio's own theories about the workings of nature do not greatly depart from Neoplatonic perspectives. According to Telesio, heat, represented by sky, is the source of life and the cause of biological functions. Cold is represented by earth, and it opposes heat. Heat also emanates spirit, which in animals and humans is located in the brain. For the purpose of anticipating and receiving sensory information, man also has an animus superadita, or mind, which is created by God and present in both spirit and body. All beings have a desire or impetus toward self-preservation, which in human beings includes a goal of everlasting life. Who was St.
What are some important facts about Johann Gottlieb Fichte's career?
Fichte was appointed professor of philosophy at the University of Jena in 1794, where he extended his Kantian idea of duty to criticize the drunkenness, lewdness, and brawling of the students. In 1795 he became an editor of the Philosophisches Journal, and in the preface to an article he was going to publish that had been written by a friend of his, he wrote that God was the moral order of the universe. There were complaints that this was an atheistic view, and so the governments of Saxony and other German states suppressed the Philosophisches Journal and demanded that Fichte be kicked out of Jena. Fichte defended himself in writing and then threatened to resign his university position. The Jena University authorities interpreted his threat as an offer, which they immediately accepted, so he lost his position there. Much later, in 1810, he became the first professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin. Fichte's independent philosophy was first stated in Foundation of the Science of Knowledge. 1794, and popularized in the Vocation of Man, 1800. In 1796 he wrote Foundations of Natural Right, which was his treatment of natural law. In 1808 he gave a series of speeches to the German nation in French-occupied Berlin. Published as Addresses to the German Nation in 1922. In those talks, Fichte supported resistance against French dictator Napoleon Bonaparte, arguing for the common good.
What is French feminism?
French feminism is a school of thought named by feminists outside France to refer to work mainly proffered by Luce Irigaray. 1932, Hélène Cixous, 1937, and Julia Kristeva, 1941. But none of these three is originally from France. And from time to time each has denied being a feminist. What Irigaray, Cixous, and Kristeva all share is that their work is based on considerations of philosophical and psychoanalytic texts. They all assume that to improve the situation of women, fundamental psychological structures need to be revised. That is, they are working within the tradition of structuralism. By comparison, there is another group of French feminists whose work is more sociological and activist than theoretical. Known as French materialist feminists, they address the situation of women by attempting to change society through political activism and work in the social sciences. Key figures are Simone de Beauvoir, 1908–1986, Christine Delphi. 1941, Monique Wittig, 1935–2003, and Colette Guillaumin, 1934. Some of their theoretical work, which has been especially influential in the Communist Revolutionary League, describes the ways in which the free labor of women in the family supports capitalism.
Who was Maurice Merleau-Ponty?
Maurice Merleau-Ponty, 1908–1961. Was an anti-empiricist who sought to reconstruct the world based on a phenomenology of human perception. He was influenced by Edmund Husserl, 1859–1938, was friends with Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905–1980, for a while, and continues to be of great interest to phenomenological philosophers of mind. His principal works are The Phenomenology of Perception, 1945. Numerous essays, and his unfinished The Visible and the Invisible.
What is the school of thought of Buddhism?
The general structure of Buddhism as a school of thought is based on a religious belief in reincarnation, which is known as the will of life. The spiritual ideal is for the individual to stop being reincarnated by adopting behavior with the correct karma, or consequences. The will of life is propelled by the flame of desire. The main obstacle to enlightenment is thereby identified as desire. Desire for people, money, power, fame, objects, and anything else. By following the Eightfold Path, a practitioner will snuff out his or her flame of desire and no longer need to return to this earth. There are three precepts or self-evident truths: that all life is unhappy or unsatisfying, that all life is impermanent, and that there is no eternal or even permanent self or soul. From these precepts, the Eightfold Path manifests itself: right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, right views, and right intentions.